I'm kind of curious about your experience of investigating these narratives. What patterns do you see among experiencer stories?
So authenticity, right? Appropriate affect and understanding that what they are communicating defies our conventional understandings of, what is real. Things that emerge repeatedly in the testimony, distortions in time or different experiences of time, either gaps of missing time, extended time, condensed time, where however much time the individual has experienced there's some kind of discrepancy between what seemingly has passed in objective reality. And it's not only just their mental experience. Sometimes it's the amount of time that their body has seemed to have experienced as well. Patterns in the conscious experience, like the expanded states of consciousness that sometimes occur during the event or after the event, the telepathic communication, the increased psychic abilities, the receipt of information non-locally, and patterns in the type of information that's received, human evolution, of environmental disaster, of reasons why that they're here and involved in the project. Many experiencers emerge, but with a completely different understanding of reality. New metaphysical understandings about what the universe is, about what the human being is, new ethical values in terms of how they relate to others, other human beings, non-human life, the earth.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Fire in the Cosmos. I'm Sinead Willihan, and my co-host is Anthony Miller. And we offer a Canadian and American perspective on the UFO topic, not to mention many other interrelated subjects. And we have someone really, really wonderful to introduce to you today. In just a minute, Anthony's going to do that. But we just wanted to say thank you to everyone who takes the time to listen to our episodes. We really, really appreciate your support. We're still a little bit of a little baby podcast. So all of your support means a lot to us. We love doing what we do, and we feel like these conversations are really, really important to share. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your comments and your likes, for sharing with your friends and your family. Consider joining our Patreon. We're going to be putting out some juicy stuff for you. And soon enough, we will have a Substack. We keep teasing that, but it's actually going to happen. So please stay tuned for that. And we also have some other exciting events to share with you that we hope that you'll join in with us so that we can get to know you better and become part of a community. If that's what we're trying to do ultimately, is create a connective, meaningful community here through conversation and discussion around very important topics relevant to our time now on Earth. So please like, subscribe, share, and come back for more. And thank you for being here once again. And on that note, I will pass it over to Anthony.
Thank you, Sinead, and hello, everyone. So we are here today with a friend of mine, Kimberly Engels. Kimberly S. Engels is an associate professor of philosophy at Molloy University and research director of the John Mack Institute. Her philosophical research centers on existentialism, ethics, and phenomenology as tools for examining our lived experience. Her UAP research focuses on the lived conscious experience of people who report contact with UAP, and how such accounts engender new frameworks for our conceptions of self, other, and world. Her book, Contact and Multidimensional Subjectivity Towards a Phenomenology of Disclosure, is forthcoming in the Marked States series with College Publications, series editor Randolph Dibble. Hello, Kim, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So one question that we love to start off our podcast with, and feel free to answer this however you like. And if there's not much there, that's totally cool. But we love to get an idea of what people were like as a child to kind of see how their trajectory has formed throughout life. So what about you? What were you like as a child?
I was a pretty typical child. I was always interested in what we might call like paranormal or anomalous things. Like I remember I had a book about UFOs and the Bigfoot, and Loch Ness Monster was a big one for me. And just like weird things always kind of intrigued me. And I remember also as a teenager being really intrigued with the Hopkinsville UFO story.
Mm.
Um, that I remember kind of sitting up late, like reading about it and just, not being convinced by the conventional explanations that they had tried to use to explain it away and just thinking it was really weird. So, I mean, I don't have much else. I mean, there's certainly some things that I look back at my childhood and I think, oh, that was interesting and maybe that connects to something going on now, but I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, awesome.
Well, I'm just thinking, I want to draw that out a little bit more because we are curious about people's origin stories. So I'm kind of wondering if you feel like you were a relatively normal child or maybe a little bit interested in weird things, how did you end up where you are right now? What do you think was this beginning, like the spark or the turning point or the catalyst that got you interested in even weirder stuff enough to make a profession out of it?
I was always interested in big questions. I was interested in philosophical questions about the meaning of life, about why we're here, about what we're doing, about morality, about what the universe is, and about what we are. And I was interested in that even when I was younger, in part because my father was a philosophy professor.
Mm.
And a theologian as well. So
Mm.
I came from a household where those kind of questions were encouraged. And I also, when I went to college, one of the greatest gifts that my parents gave me was just the blessing to be myself and to study what I wanted to study and to do what interested me. And philosophy interested me. I didn't actually go to college thinking that I would major in philosophy and religion, which is what I ended up in, dual religious studies and philosophy. I went to study music, but I really enjoyed my religion courses. I really enjoyed my philosophy courses. And I thought, this is where I feel at home. This is where I feel like I'm doing what I'm meant to be doing. And for a long time, I was a more traditional philosopher. I mean, I guess I was still a bit esoteric because I did philosophy of lived experience and phenomenology. And I was connecting philosophical ideas to experiences people had, but I wasn't doing anything that we would call paranormal or weird. I was teaching more traditional philosophy and ethics courses until, 2020. A lot of things changed. I became interested again in the phenomenon. And then as I was reading these experience accounts, I could see, these have philosophical implications. These have religious implications. These are profoundly important for these big questions that I've always studied: who we are, what we're doing here, what the universe is. And so, it came to a point that it would be disingenuous for me to continue as a philosopher and to not engage these experiences directly. And so that's what I decided to do. But when I became a philosophy professor, I wasn't like, oh, I want to do that because I want to study UFOs and weird things. I was just being a philosophy professor. Things became very different after 2020, and my research took a new turn.
What do you think that was because of COVID?
It was a lot of things. I don't know how much of the story you want. I mean,
A
certainly
lot?
being home during COVID. Being home during COVID gave me time that I otherwise would not have had.
Hmm.
Also, my best friend died at the beginning of 2020, and then there was a lot of things that happened in the months after dealing with her death to come to terms with what had happened. But I would say coincidentally, but I don't think it was a coincidence. It was more synchronicity. I watched James Fox's The Phenomenon documentary towards the end of 2020, and this was because I was at home during COVID with things to do, or just with time to kill.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I saw John Mack for the first time. I saw the Ariel school encounter, and I was very intrigued, and I was kind of up late that night Googling, who is this John Mack individual, this Harvard psychiatrist who was taking these experiences seriously, and ended up ordering his book that night. And that was kind of just the entry point into a rabbit hole. One book led to another. It was like I would finish one and then the next one would come into my orbit. Reading all of Whitley Strieber's books, all of Bud Hopkins' books, Jacques Vallée's texts, got into Jeffrey Kripal's work, got into Michael Zimmerman's work, and then all of those things just gradually led to connections within the community with the John Mack Institute that that brought us to this point. It wasn't instant, it unfolded over a period of 2 to 3 years.
Wow. That sounds very much like my trajectory getting into this, which started around that same time. Also kicked off by, it wasn't a documentary though, it was a book.
Okay.
For me, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon.
Okay, great book.
But very similar path, like in terms of feeling led and finding these connections, except because I suck at reading things through it. Mine was more through podcasts and video and audio consumption. But yeah, that's fascinating that's how you got into all this. For those who are not aware, the John Mack, the case mentioned, Ariel School is shown, I think, in the last like 15 or 20 minutes of the Phenomenon documentary, right? And James kind of touches on that a bit. Yeah, and he shows some of the footage from the 90s of that case, which was this amazing mass UFO and NHI sighting at this school in rural Zimbabwe. And yeah, the footage there shows interviews that John Mack conducted with several of the children. I think there were like 60 some witnesses, something like that. One of my favorite cases. I don't know about you, Sinead, but that one is amazing.
Yeah. And also the Hopkinsville UFO encounter as well. So weird. I mean, the beings and what's like, and there's so many. I'm very into 14ism. So there's also the case of the Sandown ghost clown. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one.
That one I'm not familiar with.
There's just so many intriguing, bizarre stories that could make you go either one way or the other. Like you think this is too weird. It can't possibly be true. And it's so weird that there's something about it that is compelling. And also the way that the story is told by the people who were there, the people who experience it, right? Like to me, that has a lot to do with it, is the intensity of the experience and how that gets communicated by the people who were there. It's just so authentic. You can't deny it. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So in terms of John Mack, you have gotten to know several people in the field who work within you're doing work in the John Mack Institute, and you are collaborating with so many people who are thinking about experiencers and thinking about how those narratives have been, kind of a roller coaster aspect of the ufology community, because there are people who have a really hard time digesting experiencers' stories. There's other people who completely believe them right away, who are, for whatever reason, they have their own experiences, they're very open-minded, whatever it is. And then people who are in the middle. And I'm kind of curious about your experience of investigating these narratives. What patterns do you see among experiencer stories that really land for you and help you feel like it gives you something that you can communicate to other people to help them understand this is really happening?
Well, I don't feel a need to convince anybody else that it's really happening, whatever that means. I think these stories are self-evidently authentic. So here's some things that I identify. And if people want to believe or not believe, that's up to them. But first of all, people are sincere. They report these stories with appropriate affect and with understanding of the unbelievability of or of the apparent unbelievability of what they are experiencing. And I mean, going back to Hopkinsville, the police officers who responded that night, if you read through their testimony, these people were terrified. One of them had a pulse of 140 beats per minute. You can't fake that, and he said, he gave a statement. He said, these aren't even people who normally would make the journey into town to come to the police department. Like if they feel threatened by something, they're people who would just get their guns and fire at it. He said they made the journey into town because they were genuinely terrified and they had seen something that they could not explain. And it was 12 people had all seen it. And every explanation that they tried to give for that event, that it was owls, that it was a monkey that was escaped from somewhere nearby, none of those would lead those individuals to have that kind of reaction. It just becomes, in my mind, more absurd to try to explain it away than to just accept that something genuinely anomalous took place. So authenticity, right? Appropriate affect and understanding that what they are communicating defies our conventional understandings of, what is real. If you want to talk about just general patterns, things that emerge repeatedly in the testimony distortions in time or different experiences of time, either gaps of missing time, extended time, condensed time, where however much time the individual has experienced there's some kind of discrepancy between what seemingly has passed in objective reality. And it's not only just their mental experience. Sometimes it's the amount of time that their body has seemed to have, experienced as well. So that is really, a pattern that we see. Also, the patterns in the conscious experience, like the expanded states of consciousness that sometimes occur during the event or after the event, the telepathic communication, the increased psychic abilities, the receipt of information non-locally, and patterns in the type of information that's received. It's obviously not all identical, but the themes that emerge of, human evolution, of environmental disaster, of reasons why that they're, here and involved in the project. And then something that's really interesting for me is the changes that the individual experiencers go through in the aftermath, because many experiencers emerge, and it's not always instant. It often unfolds over time, but with a completely different understanding of reality. New metaphysical beliefs, new metaphysical understandings about what the universe is, about what the human being is, and new ethical orientations, new ethical values in terms of how they relate to others, other human beings, non-human life, the earth. Those are patterns that, again, it's not 100%, but it's significant enough in the phenomenological experience of this that just dismissing this all as forms of pathology or delusion or explainable, as just through something traditional doesn't add up for me. The way that people walk away from this, they don't walk away unchanged. And to me, to go through a change that profound, and to morph into a way of relating to reality that I call in the book multidimensional subjectivity, a way of anchoring oneself in reality with an expanded understanding of what the human being is and of what the universe is. To me, that emerges from some type of authentic experience. And I don't claim to know exactly what the source of that experience is. I don't claim to know who or what is behind the UAP or exactly what mechanisms make these experiences possible, but I know, or I'm convinced, I guess, that there's something to them, and that these are not things that we should just be writing off or, attempting to explain away through our traditional frameworks just because they violate the boundaries of the consensus reality.
And is that what you have seen happening traditionally up to this point with our past paradigms?
Have I seen? Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Like, have you seen these distortions and this pathologizing happening in academia and science up to this point in this way?
Yeah. I mean, I think that almost goes without saying. Yeah. I mean, these experiences haven't been taken seriously. I mean, John Mack took them seriously, and he almost lost his tenure and his medical license because he didn't diagnose people as just psychotic. Our frameworks for engaging this, at least from an academic context, have been woefully insufficient. The idea is that we can either engage it as something that people believe happened to them, and we can say, what mechanisms led them to believe that this happened, but we stay far clear from suggesting that it actually may have happened or anything similar to what they described actually happened. Or, they try to find a psychological mechanism to explain it. There was a recent book that came out, a neuroscience book, that tried to say, they just used the Betty and Barney Hill abduction and said it was explainable through sleep paralysis and leading and hypnosis or something like that. That just came out like a month ago. So that's been the tradition of academic research on these topics, right? Yeah. It starts with the presumption that they cannot possibly be happening as described, and that has to be the baseline through which you explore them. And I think that's the wrong starting point. I'm happy to talk about what I think the starting point should be, but I'll pause for now.
Please, I would love to hear that. I don't know about Sinead.
Yeah, me too. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so, and I don't want to turn this into an advertisement for my book, but my book is coming out, and I would, these are the ideas that are developed there. Taking a phenomenological standpoint, it's this idea of treating an experience on its own terms for how it appears in the subject's lived experience, so how they describe it, understanding how that experience generates what we could call a life world, a world of experience, of categories that we use, distinctions that we use to make sense of the world, and exploring the experiencer's meaning making. What did this experience mean for them, without necessarily, saying that we don't have to endorse everybody's meaning making and saying, okay, well, they obviously have the answer, but listen to it. Are there patterns in meaning making? Is there collective meaning making that we can get out of this? And starting with, it's a metaphor of Jeffrey Kripal's, but it's a useful one. Begin by leaving everything on the table. Begin with not starting with this idea of, okay, these are the types of things that exist, and these are the experiences that are true, or these are the types of experiences that are possible. And anything that falls out of these parameters, we have to be able to explain it away, or just ignore it completely, which is more often done. Leave it all there. This is what people are describing as appearing. Look at what appears. Allow it to appear on its own terms. How did they live it? How did it appear to them? How did they make sense of it? How did they interpret it? And just start there. Allow what emerges to emerge without immediately deciding what it has to mean. And I think that even within the UFO community, with people who do take this seriously, there's often an immediate need to put a label on it, an immediate need to say it was this. I saw a Pleiadian, or I saw a gray, and it communicated this to me, and this particular thing is going to happen because I got it from that exchange. And to just lock in the meaning and lock in the interpretation. And I think so much of this is really ambiguous. It is really indeterminate. And that we lose something when we try to force it into an easy category, because so much of it doesn't fit into a lot of the categories that we use to explain our world, to explain experience. A lot of it blurs boundaries. So can we let things appear? Can we let people speak about their experiences in the language that makes sense to them? Can we honor those experiences and their meaning making on their own terms, and then start collectively having a discussion about what it all may mean, both for human consciousness, both for the universe that we inhabit, and very importantly, for how we relate to each other, how we relate to the earth, that is being honest in terms of leaving everything on the table, and that is not prematurely either dismissing things or prematurely deciding what something must mean, or deciding what something is in advance.
Love that. Love that. Riffing on that a little bit more, I want to talk about how you define phenomenology. You were just describing, I want to link it to how people describe their experiences, because you were just referencing that a few times, that's very important, to listen to how people are describing their experiences, not try to fit them into a pre-existing framework. It's so important to live in the space of I don't know, right, where all possibilities are available and we can investigate them. So my understanding is that you describe phenomenology as focusing on experience before exploration. Before explanation, not exploration, explanation. So just allowing the experience to exist, exactly what you just said, the way you just described it. So because of that, do you think that modern science moves not only too quickly to explain these things, but do you think that because it moves too quickly, that it loses a grip on what is available, like that information that's there, that's coming forward from experiencers, from documented multiple witness experiences? Do you think that, and this might be a super obvious question, but I'm still asking it anyway, for people who are maybe newer to this field or who are more left brain thinkers, the nebulousness of it is incredibly important and is not to be devalued, right, as you're stressing right now. So when someone is describing their anomalous phenomenological experience, that was a mouthful, there's so much value and information and data and knowledge just in their description, which is not the normal way, I guess, that someone would acquire information for a research study, right? So we have all these people who are academics and scientists coming in and wanting to figure out what's going on, trying very hard to do that, maybe rushing it, trying to fit it into these pre-existing boxes. And as a result of that, do you think they completely lose the plot? Or what do you think happens after they try to do that?
The problem isn't that they're rushing it. The problem is that science as a method is very good at studying very specific things. It's very good at studying physical phenomena that are observable and repeatable under some kind of control.
Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful at that. But there's a lot of things that don't unfold that way. Science is not great at studying first person experience. It was never really intended to do that because first person experience is not observable in the third person or on instruments because by its very definition, it's first person, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really that science is, it's not that it's doing anything wrong, and it's not that they should stop doing what they're doing. It's just incomplete. And what the problem is not the scientific method. It's thinking that the scientific method is the only access that we have to truth, because that's a presumption, right? That's bringing something to the table that the only things that are true and real are things that are observable, that are physical, right?
Yeah.
Physical, observable, and repeatable under some kind of control, and that's all that's real, or that can be explained in terms of cause and effect. Established some type of causality between them, and then it's scientifically proven. A lot of things just simply do not present that way. And experiencer testimony does not present that way. So trying to apply the scientific method to experiencer testimony, it's a category error. It's trying to apply something that is very good at studying physical phenomena to studying the realm of experience, which it was never intended to do. Now, by all means, they should continue. There's nothing wrong with the experiments that they're doing and what they're trying to, of the physical objects when they can get them on the instruments. Kevin Knuth is doing some great work with this. Wes Waters is doing great work with this. I'm not in any way, shape, or form dismissing the scientific work that's going on. I think it's important. I think they should keep doing it. I'm just saying we need to do this too, because that is only going to tell one part of the story. Even if they could find, okay, we've figured out exactly what the physical components of this is and what it's made up of. All right, that might be a really interesting piece of the story, but it's going to be one small piece. And there is a lot more that comes in this world of lived experience that has to work, not competing, but complementary with what they're doing over there. But the problem becomes that when experiencers are reporting things that seem impossible by the standards of science, because we have for so long said that science is our threshold of producing the truth, then it's like that becomes the starting point of, well, they're saying something that doesn't seem possible from a physical standpoint, from how we scientifically understand the universe. So obviously what they're saying is false. And that to me is a problem. If a lot of people are saying that they experienced something that defies the laws of science as we understand them, then we should ask the question, maybe our understanding of the laws of science are incomplete. Not necessarily wrong, but incomplete. And we need to rethink and think, hey, wait, what are we missing? Are we missing something that would allow these experiences to be unfolding in the way that people are describing them? Or what possibilities might we be overlooking because we've been too rigid in our categories of possibility and impossibility?
Love that.
Yeah. Thank you, Kim. So kind of to piggyback off that, one of the places where I first really got to hear you riff on a lot of this was a course that I took with you, where you taught the connections between the UFO phenomenon and the shamanic world and indigenous traditions. Can you discuss that a bit and how perhaps those worldviews may have approached these topics in a way that we could learn from in our current paradigm?
Sure. I mean, shamanic worldviews is obviously very broad. That could encompass a lot of different cultures. But just looking at indigenous American cultures and tribal groups as an example, there's what Kyle White calls epistemologies of coordination, or Wahinkpe Topa and Darcia Narvaez call it the kinship worldview. And it's a very different understanding of the universe than the Western scientific worldview. It understands the world through kinship relations. Begins with the idea that everything's conscious, that everything has some form of consciousness. Not just humans, not just animals, plants, all of natural things have some level of consciousness to them. It's we could call an animism. Yeah. And that we are in relationship, with all of these different beings, and that there's an understanding of the human being as interconnected with other natural species on Earth, but also an understanding that we're occupying a universe that's filled with all types of entities that the Western scientific worldview does not recognize. And in some tribal cultures, these are referred to as, the star people or the star ancestors. RD6 Killer Clark's work on this is really good.
Mm.
So Indigenous American people have long reported contact with different entities from the sky, right?
Mhm.
Again, many, like the Hopi, have an understanding that they themselves came from the star people, right? And they also have a very healthy relationship with altered states of consciousness, that truth can be revealed through altered states of consciousness. They're not understood to be distortive, but of actually giving you more access to the truth, a wider understanding of the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And they often will communicate with star people, star beings, star ancestors in altered states of consciousness. And again, none of this is seen as pathological. These entities are understood to exist and communicated with over the generations. Often also seen as a positive force in humanity's evolutionary development, but also understood to be capable of physically manifesting, but also capable of presenting in purely spiritual forms as well, or in the other realms, right? Accessed only in some type of subtle realm or spiritual dimension. And that's not seen as problematic, and that's not seen as less real. Because in Indigenous worldviews, there's not an understanding that only the physical is real. They regularly interact with spiritual realms, or what we would call spiritual realms, and those are equally, if not more real than what's going on in the physical. So the idea that sometimes these beings are seen only in an altered state of consciousness or in an out-of-body experience, or communicated with, during a vision quest or something like that, that's not a problem, and that doesn't make them any less real. And the psychic abilities coming online, again, isn't experienced as disruptive or as ontologically shocking, because they have a worldview that accommodates that. They have a worldview where things are conscious, and consciousness can communicate non-locally. So I mean, really, it shows how much these baseline assumptions we make about the universe and what kind of things are and are not possible shape how we experience and interpret these experiences when they happen, right? Like these contact experiences. They're much less ontologically shocking to individuals who come from a worldview where it's understood that the universe is filled with a multitude of intelligences that may communicate with us, sometimes physically and sometimes not, and never really have this anthropocentric idea that humans are the highest life form in the universe. They, have always understood that there are many species that are more advanced than us, physically, mentally, spiritually, and perhaps in terms of technology as well.
Yeah.
Is there anything in specific you wanted me to go into about there's a lot of different ways that we, a lot of different connections between shamanic worldviews and shamanic practices and these experiences. Did you have anything in particular?
Yeah, I guess it would be interesting to see where you can take it with this notion that I came across in your course, that I think you connected it to some of John Mack's research on this topic. And this was the notion of intersubjectivity of experience, and how perhaps that could be a way for us to start looking at it in the Western world, as opposed to just viewing things as objective and subjective, like you were discussing earlier, where we seem to be running against this block of how to understand these phenomena.
Yeah, so I think that was actually from the second course you took with me,
Okay,
which was Phenomenology of Intersubjectivity. But I'm happy to speak about intersubjectivity because this is when we're talking about science, there's a lot of focus on this idea of being as objective as possible, or of, positing when it's on the instruments, then it's somehow a view from nowhere. First of all, that's not never entirely possible. You're always bringing a view, you're always bringing a lens of interpretation to the experience. And many times things that people argue are like maximally unbiased are just biased in a different way, back to this idea that only things that are physical and that emerge under repeatable controls are real. That's not a fact, right? In the way that it's often presented. But in the history of science, there's a very interesting book by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison called Objectivity, and they trace the ideal, and show that even within science itself, that ideal of what objectivity is has gone through several different transformations. It's not fixed, right? But it was always paired with subjectivity. And as science progressed, there became this idea in the 19th century that subjectivity was a threat to objectivity, and being objective as a scientist meant stripping as much of your own view and your own subjectivity completely out of out of the analysis, and making it, again, as much as possible, this a view from nowhere. There was an emphasis on machination at that time, like outsourcing things to machines, starting using things, trusting instruments more than observation, the ability of things to be reproduced mechanically. So my suggestion is that for experience, this idea of objectivity doesn't really work, and also that it's not fully desirable. This whole idea that we strip our lived experience and everything that makes us a self out of the equation. Maybe it's useful in certain contexts, but I don't think it's useful for studying close encounters, because what happens to the self is an integral part of the story and an integral part of the truth that is produced. And so I propose, thinking about, rather than objectivity, we start thinking about intersubjectivity, meaning, what aspects of this are, first of all, perhaps witnessed by more than one person, and that there may be points of corroboration in terms of what they see within a single event, or that there may be intersubjectivity across events, meaning that what was experienced in one person's account seems very similar, at least phenomenologically. They may have interpreted it differently, but the appearance seems very similar to something that's going on in a different reported experience over here. So there's those layers of intersubjectivity. But there's also considering the interaction with the UFO or the UAP or the NHI itself as an intersubjective interaction, a meeting of two different intelligences, of two different minds who are having a different experience. And in that meeting of another consciousness, what does that mean for the self? What does the self become in the presence of an other whose faculties are, first of all, mysterious, but also appear substantially more advanced than ours and lead to a situatedness of our own subjectivity? So exploring intersubjectivity that way, but also exploring the intersubjectivity in our meaning making, right? So John Mack, in the final chapter of Abduction, he says, this is an intersubjective process. He says, I do not claim that the accounts that I'm getting from people are lifted out of them in the way that you would lift a stone from a kidney. He says, what I'm bringing out is co-created between me and them. But again, from a purely, this ideal of objectivity, that's understood as distortion, right? That he's distorting the narratives. But from the lens of intersubjectivity, that co-creation of meaning, that reframing of the experience, there's something new that could come out of it that would not have been there in the individual alone or for Mac working on it alone, but emerged when their two understandings of the experience came together. And if you look through the history of the phenomenon, of different experiencer accounts, there's quite often a significant intersubjective moment for the experiencer in terms of their meaning making, when if they have a sympathetic witness, if they have someone who's taking them seriously, where they say, hey, did you think about this? And all of a sudden this light bulb goes off and there's a new reframing, right? Even just give the example of Whitley Strieber. His wife, Anne, made this profound, she was looking through all the letters that people sent him, and she said, this has something to do with what we call death. And that was a major moment. She didn't have her own experiences, right? It was such an interesting dynamic, because Whitley was having all of these things going on and Anne wouldn't experience them, or she would experience, she would be turned off or something while they were going on. But she was so integral to his meaning making, right? And there's so many insights, I believe, that he had that he would not have had without her. So there's that layer of intersubjectivity as well, that I think, it's all just these different dimensions that we can use the intersubjective as I think, more fruitful starting point for starting to wade through some of this than this idea of the objective. Now, again, this doesn't mean that the objective measurements that the scientists have don't mean anything. I'm just saying that's not the only or most useful framework for looking at the contact encounters.
Yeah. Right. So Let's add ethics into this, because I know ethics are a really big part of your interest, your research, your work. So with regard to ethics and the other, right, otherness, or whatever it is that we're experiencing that we think is other in terms of the phenomenon, if we take experiencers seriously without making any claims about what they possibly encountered, just receiving their narrative, receiving their stories and their descriptions, how does that shift our ethical responsibilities towards them? Like, and also actually towards our interaction with other intelligences. I'll just leave it at that.
So how does that shape our ethical responsibility towards experiencers?
Well, if we take experiencers seriously without making any claims about what they experienced, like without doing the scientific methodology, without trying to organize it into pre-existing boxes of knowledge, we just take them seriously. We listen to their narrative. We listen to their descriptions. How does that action shift our ethical response? Well, actually, regardless of how we're taking in their stories, but mostly if we're someone who's in a position of listening, of just receiving it without judgment, right? We're not trying to make it into something that makes sense to us. We're receiving it as how it makes sense to experiencers. How can we use that platform as a way of shifting our ethical responsibilities towards experiencers and also towards our interactions with the intelligences that they seem to be communicating with?
I mean, so a couple of points of clarification. I absolutely think the phenomenological starting point is very important, leaving it all on the table. I don't think that we can never get to the point where we start trying to make sense collectively of what it may mean, or trying out a hypothesis. How well does the future humans hypothesis fit some of the experiences, and being honest about the ones that it fits and the ones that it doesn't. Yes. And I think that actually, Michael Masters has done a pretty good job of that, of being honest, like this really fits these experiences. It doesn't fit these. So, leaving it all on the table does allow us the possibility of trying out different hypotheses, seeing, how much could this explain? And I think that that should be an integral part of the process, but you start with leaving it all on the table. Mm-hmm. In terms of like our ethics towards experiencers have for many years been recipients of epistemic injustice, meaning that their credibility as knowers has been completely just dismissed. They've been pathologized, they've been mocked, they've been dismissed. The moment that they have that they report that they have this kind of experience, they receive credibility deficits, meaning that the hearers, first of all, don't see them as credible. But often, even when there are platforms that they're given to speak, the audience is not in a position to fully understand what they're trying to communicate about their experiences. And sometimes that ignorance is more pernicious than others. Sometimes there has been no attempt made to understand, but sometimes, so much about these experiences defies language, defies conceptual categorization, just defies our categories that we use to make sense of the world, that even if experiencer is like given a platform on CNN to talk about what they experience, how many people are going to be in a position to actually hear them?
Yeah.
Or even at some of these UFO conferences that happen, if an experiencer is there, speaking about giving all the details of what they experience, because sometimes it can be really weird and it involves, a sexual experience or leaving their body, or half of it was dreamed and half of it was awake, or, it was a viscerally physical experience where they felt their body transported elsewhere. How many people, even in a standard UFO conference audience, would be prepared to fully conceptualize or just like fully hear what they're trying to say without rolling their eyes or being like, whoa, this is too much.
Yeah.
And I'm asking that kind of as an open question, but my gut is that a lot of, even at, a UFO conference, a lot of people would not be prepared to fully grasp a lot of what's going on here. It's just, some of it's just seen as like way too out there. Like, that's too far. I'm willing to admit that, but that, whoa, right? Yeah. You just took it to a level I'm not prepared to go.
Yeah.
So, I think that phenomenology can serve as a form of restorative hearing, in the sense that we're going to go back, we're going to take a step back, we're going to leave it all on the table. We need to truly listen, not just to what they remember happening, but how it affected the structures that they use to make sense of the world, and their meaning making in the aftermath. How did this affect their sense of self, their sense of otherness, their values, their metaphysical beliefs, and allowing it to stand. If they thought it was horrible and that's their experience, Then we don't say, no, your experience was wrong. This is actually a really good thing. And the fact that you think it's horrible means that you're missing something. Yeah. If they experience it as horrible, we listen to that. If they experienced it as life-changing and transformative, we listen to that, right? We also, I think, something that really is missing, and I know that this is hard to do, but I really make a case for it in the last couple of chapters of my book. A lot of experiencers, throughout these experiences, they receive knowledge, like they receive downloads of information related to the nature of consciousness, the nature of reality, the nature of what human beings are doing here, of what contact is, of what the universe is. Sometimes I get downloads of like scientific information, and there's nowhere for them to really go with it. So let's start listening to it. Let's see if some of these models or some of these things that they've been told, or that this information that's come through, let's see if it checks out. Let's put it to the test. You know, maybe some of it's total bunk. Some of it might not be, right? But let's be brave enough to not only look at what happened, but what they got from it, and start using their input as ideas for how we can think about this phenomenon, how we can think about ourselves as knowers, and how we can think about the relationship between ourselves as knowers and the universe. I think that we can do it. We just have to have the epistemic flexibility, the epistemic humility, and just like a little bit of courage, right? To be bold. And I think that we can do it. So I mean, that's the ethos, that's the ethics that I would like to bring to thinking about experiencers. And also, you know, full witnessing, not partial witnessing. Not saying, okay, I'm going to listen to your narrative if it fits my understanding of what I think UFOs are. And I think that UFOs are alien spacecraft. So if your narrative lines up with my idea that they're alien spacecraft, then I'm going to hear it. But if it doesn't, then I'm just going to turn off. I'm going to say, well, no, obviously, you know, whatever you got going on over there, where you think that these are interdimensional entities and that you had, you know, an out-of-body spiritual experience with them, does not align with my understanding that these flew here from another planet. So allow it to appear on its own terms, and with full witnessing of how they experienced it, and not fitting it in or prematurely trying to reduce it. You know, no narrative flattening, right? No flattening out the high strangeness elements, no flattening out the sexual elements, no flattening out the anomalous conscious experiences. All of that's part of it. If we're going to make sense of any of it, we have to leave it all on the table. I have some thoughts on the second part of your question in terms of our ethical interactions with non-human intelligence, but I want to pause for a moment in case there's something you want to follow up on that particular point.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking about is, first of all, what you just said made me think about how important I personally feel that listening is. I mean, we all know listening is very important. It's really easy to talk, right? But it's harder to really, truly listen, right? And I'm a deaf person. And so listening is a very big part of my life journey. And it's been a gift, because it's a get to know listening in a way that, in many ways, right? Not just with my ears. And so yeah. And so, I mean, that's part of how I experience the phenomenon, right? So anyway, just with regard to truly listening to experiencers, I feel like what came to my mind was that for a lot of people, maybe more than ever in this current time when we're so distracted from ourselves, I wonder if asking people to do that is is a big ask, you know, like that's a deep skill, being able to truly listen to someone with no judgment, no bias, not trying to categorize in any way, consciously or unconsciously. So, I mean, to me, it kind of speaks to, I think, the work that we all really need to do on, you know, just being better humans and trying to evolve ourselves, and looking at consciousness as being fundamental, and, you know, trying to better our skills as human beings so that we can have better interrelational experiences with each other and support each other better, and explore all our relationships cosmologically, right? And then be able to digest them a little better with that kind of receptivity. But I also would love to hear what you're saying about what you want to say about the ethics of interacting with other forms of intelligence, because Anthony and I have talked a lot about this. There's a narrative out there. There's different narratives out there about what could be going on with these other intelligences, and what their intentions may or may not be, and why they may or may not be here. So, or why they're here. So there seems to be something of a dominant, and I want to ask you if you feel the same way. In my personal perception, there seems to be a dominant fear-based narrative, you know, like they're kind of scary. They could be very powerful. They could have all this technology that we don't have that gives them power over us. They can disempower our nuclear sites and disempower our weaponry. You know, they're taking away our power and our agency. And what are we going to do? And how can we defend ourselves? So also, I think so many people have had frightening experiences, right? Or experiences that seemed frightening or felt frightening at the time. But as we know from Ray Hernandez and the Free study, right, the follow-up that was done with a lot of experiencers, is that the fear doesn't always last, right? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people realize, oh, I was scared in the moment because it was so ontologically shocking, it was so unfamiliar, it was so visceral, whatever. And now I realize that that was actually to my benefit. And it was to help me on my life journey in some way or another. So with regard to all the parameters of the knowledge, you know, of the way experiencers experience other intelligences and all the research you've done and the knowledge you've gathered on these stories, how do you feel what do you think the ethics are of interacting with these other species? And I know that's a very broad kind of question, but I'm just really curious how you'd speak to this. There's so many ways of looking at it. Yeah.
So there's a lot. Let me just pause a moment. In terms of the first thing you said about, you know, the relationality and truly hearing and how big of an ask this is. It is a big ask, but it's a really important ask.
Yes.
And, you know, the idea is not to have like no bias or no judgment, but to just recognize what your own biases and judgments are. Like, and not fool yourself that you're not bringing any to the table, because everyone often is, right? So trying to the extent possible to allow it to appear. And if you have a reaction to something, recognize that reaction in yourself. Recognize why that particular thing was too far for you. Because even people involved in this community, there's usually some kind of line, right? I was on a different podcast and he was like, the mantids just take it too far for me. You know, and my friend Michael Zimmerman, you know, he'd be okay with me sharing this. You know, he said for a lot of years, like Bigfoot was just too far for me. He's like, I just could not wrap my mind around that Bigfoot could possibly be real. And then now he's convinced, you know, that it is. So it's like, if something feels like, wait, they just stepped over that line, be willing to interrogate into yourself. Why did that cross the line for me? Why was I willing to accept everything up to that? And then that took it too far. And it's hard, but I think it's necessary for this, because there's just so many different ways that it presents, so many myriads and layers in the ways that it presents, that has to be our starting point of let's leave as much as we can on the table. And I say leave everything on the table if we can. In terms of this other question about the ethics of their interactions with us, so what you were speaking about here is not so much how we react towards them, but the ethics of their behavior towards us. This is obviously a really big question. There is a full chapter of my book devoted to this topic, right? How do we ethically evaluate how they're reacting to us? But also right now I'm in the middle of, or I'm in the recruitment stages for a project where we're following up with experiencers who had their experience 25 years ago or more, because we want to see how their perspectives about it have changed over time, including their perspective of like the ethics of it. Like, you know, if you felt violated at the time, do you still feel violated, or do you have a different perspective on it now? Because sometimes those things change. Not always, right? Not always, but often. And you know what they found in the Free study, Mack also found in his work, Kenneth Ring found that in his survey as well. A smaller phenomenological study that I did, that the book is based on, a lot of the experiencers, well, you know, it was a phenomenological research, is a small sample size, so it was 15 people, but many of them, even if they were initially scared, and almost all of them were, over time framed what happened, and, you know, said there was things going on in the moment that I wasn't capable of understanding at the time, but I have a new perspective on it now. So when it comes to the way that they're interacting with us, there can be, when we think about this ethically, okay, let's look at non-consensual encounters, ones where people feel like something was done to them against their will, without their consent. Even in human ethics, we can sometimes do things to someone else, or, you know, an animal, without their consent. And I'm not saying that a lot of things that we do to animals are good, but for example, I have to take my cat to the vet sometimes. She does not want to go, and I have to, against her will, shove her into the carrier and take her to the vet. As parents, for our children, we'll often make decisions for them, things that they don't want to do that are in their best interest. If someone is incapable of making their own medical decisions, good medical decisions for themselves, we may intervene. It's called, paternalism, and say, on your behalf, we're going to intervene and say that, I'm not going to do this surgery for you because I don't think that you're in the right mindset to be able to make a decision to do it. Or that I don't think it would actually truly benefit you. I think the risks are far too great and you're not thinking clearly. So we can do things against other people's will. And sometimes the reasons that we do that is because, like in the example of the cat or the small child, we may not be able to explain to them what is going on, the full scope of it. Nothing that I can do to say to the cat will get her to understand why it's actually in her best interest to go to the vet. So it could be some of that. There's an epistemic gap between us and the non-human intelligence, and they are not able to communicate to us the full scope of what is happening and why. Mm-hmm. And if they could communicate to us the full scope of what was happening and why, maybe they would. But there's another reason that sometimes we may do things deceptively or without someone's consent. It's, if being open about the reason that we're doing something might compromise the result. So just like think about a study where there's a placebo involved. If somebody knows that they're getting the placebo, that compromises the study, right? Yeah. So the deception is understood as justified in that case. So I think it's very possible that if, the NHIs came into the room and said, this is exactly what we're doing and this is the reasons why, do you want to sign this consent form? I think that it's very likely that that would not have the same result as them proceeding in the way that they are proceeding. Now, this is just a hypothesis, right? This is a hypothesis. I'm not saying that I know the answer, but I think when there are epistemic gaps between two parties in an ethical interaction, and I think there very clearly are epistemic gaps between us and them. And by epistemic gaps, I mean that they know things that we do not about the nature and purpose of contact, and also about the universe itself. Yes. They seem to be positioned in time differently and to relate to time differently. And either there's no way for us to fully conceptualize all of what's going on, or if they did just give it to us all at once and say, this is what's going on, do you want to be part of it or not? It would not have the same effects that it does. It would not have the same results. Something about the results would be compromised. Because honestly, the people who go through the transformations, it's like, again, it unfolds through time, and the moments of insight or the moments of integration where suddenly something about it makes sense and suddenly something about it is reframed, like the payoff for that is immense. Mm-hmm. And it would not have had the same effect if it had all just been handed over. Part of it is the individual realizing something about themselves, about the interaction, about the nature of reality, about the nature of the universe, coming into these new understanding of their subjectivity, of their intersubjectivity, this deeper understanding of the universe and their interconnectedness within it. And again, all of that is like a gift that seems to unfold over time, not something that is just like, okay, here it is. Let me give you all the information right now. A nuance, right? So we have to maybe rethink this straightforward, or just rethink the limitations of anthropocentric ethics. Do necessarily the categories of autonomy, harm, and consent that we use when thinking about our interactions with each other, do all of those necessarily map on one-to-one to thinking about our relationship with a species that knows things about us and the universe that we don't know? And going back to what you said, this dominant fear narrative, it's absolutely there, because we as a culture love to be afraid of things. Like, we are an extremely fear-based culture. This is another difference between the Western worldview and the, what Narvaez calls the kinship worldview. A lot of indigenous people, not just in the Americas, but all over the world, lived with a deep sense of trust in the universe and how things were unfolding, even when it doesn't appear in physical reality that things are going well. Yeah. And we don't have that in Western culture. Or we'll just speak about the United States. We are an extremely fear-based culture. We're an extremely individualist culture where we perceive each other as threats. It's just like, what new thing do we have to be afraid of? And so this idea that, alien intelligence could be the newest thing that we all are supposed to be afraid of, or that might be a threat to our sense of self, And it is a threat, I think, to our sense of self in the egoic individualist mindset that we have here. It is a threat to that.
Yes.
But I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing.
Yes.
So, there's all this resistance to it because it threatens to upset our current way of operating in the world. But again, I don't think that that's necessarily bad. So I think some of this comes from we have to think a little bit more non-dually. We have to, again, this premature, let's not slot everything into a category of good or bad right away. We don't have to consider them benevolent space brothers. They're also, I don't think, evil invaders. Like, the truth is probably somewhere in between. And what's going on is probably more complex than we're able to fully conceptualize in our morally black and white terms. And there's probably elements of it that we just can't understand. And there's also elements of it that, again, if they just gave us all the understanding right away, we'd lose something meaningful about the process.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I'm not going to talk. I just want to say there's so many things about what you just said that I just love, Kimberly. I just really appreciate that answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, you're very welcome.
Well, I guess this brings up a notion that I can go back to in the context of Indigenous traditions that I think I would like you to touch on. And that's this notion of the trickster and the paranormal, which touches on that non-duality and perhaps the wider meaning of these contact experiences. Do you mind discussing that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Chapter 7 of the book is called Traumas, Tricksters, and Transformation.
We have not seen the book yet, so we're just nailing it.
I know. You're just bringing me through all of the things that I've just spent 3 years working out on paper.
Yeah.
So
amazing. Really, it's amazing. Really. Yeah.
So first of all, the book, The Trickster and the Paranormal by George Hansen is a wonderful book. So give him credit first and foremost. Barbara Babcock has also done some really interesting work on the trickster. So not just Indigenous American cultures, but almost like every culture, ancient cultures, have some kind of trickster figure, right? And these figures, this archetype of the trickster, by the nature of their name, they play tricks. But they're very subversive figures. It's like this idea that by using trickery and deceit, they illuminate something that people otherwise would not have seen, that would have remained hidden. It's like they take the rules and order that you think hold and subvert them and kind of force you to confront the limitations of the categories that you were working with, and force you to maybe confront what aspects of yourself were there that allowed you to get tricked to begin with, or that you needed to learn that trickery was the best way for you to learn. And sometimes their behavior is really, again, it's subversive and it may be interpreted as straightforwardly harmful. His name is F. David Pete, but he wrote the book Blackfoot Physics, which was a really interesting book. It's about the Indigenous American worldviews, but he talks about the clowns, which were, he says Indigenous clowns in the Blackfoot tribe, they played a very specific role. They were trickster-like figures, but he said they would sometimes interrupt the sacred ceremonies. They would have exaggerated sexual characteristics. They would frighten people. They would sometimes beat people. But he said they were there to really give you this sense of disorder, to introduce, uncertainty into certainty, and to remind you how much is uncertain, and to violate boundaries so that you would think about the reason those boundaries are there to begin with, and maybe if they needed to be rethought, right? And so it's this example, and then to bring that into the paranormal. So with Hansen, he shows how a lot of paranormal phenomena have this deceit or trickery element to them. They don't present consistently. They're very hard to study because sometimes they'll appear and sometimes they won't. And I've even had some interactions that I honestly feel like I was interacting with an entity that gave me false information, but did so to teach me something, that did so because it was wanting me to develop my own discernment. And say, are you really going to listen just because a paranormal entity told you this, or what you perceive as a paranormal entity, just because this came from non-traditional means, that it must obviously be true? Because a lot of what comes out of it, and Jacques Vallée studied this too, right? He said about 50% of what they say, these UFO entities, it's nonsense. He would go to what's that one, the Eagle River incident. The UFO lands and they walk out there and They ask him for a jug of water. It's this farmer out in the middle of Wisconsin. They ask him for a jug of water. And so he goes in his house and he brings him a jug of water, and then they feed him pancakes. They were like cooking inside their ship, and he eats the pancakes, and then he also saves one of the pancakes and he takes it to a lab, and it turns out it was just like purely human terrestrial ingredients. And he says, nothing about
Without
this
the salt,
makes
right?
Yeah.
There was something about the salt.
I don't remember, but yeah, it was like 3 ingredients, and they were all human terrestrial ingredients, and that's what they fed him. And so, he says it just seems absurd. Like, why, if these are supposedly entities who flew across the universe, they need a jug of water when they get there? Come on. There's something about it that doesn't add up. And he says the temptation is, when it doesn't add up, the temptation is for us to say it's all just nonsense, right? But he says that's a dangerous temptation. He said, don't go there. There's something else about the way that this is presenting that's deeper. And so, I think when we look at, often in Indigenous traditions, Gerald Visenor has some really good work on this. The trickster is a liberatory figure, ultimately. Like, that, yes, they use deception in their means, but they're trying to expose you to a deeper truth. And they're trying to get you to question the parameters of your everyday experience, the things that you're taking for granted, the way that you're doing things may not be ideal in a lot of ways. And so the deception serves, again, a moral purpose. They're trying to teach you something that you otherwise wouldn't see. And again, that's the trickster archetype that functions in a lot of different cultures, but it's not something that's considered, it's not evil. It's not morally bad. It's just there in a non-dual way, and it's there to, again, serve as ultimately something that can be liberatory, even though it doesn't mean that you're always going to enjoy interacting with it. It doesn't mean that every aspect of the interaction is going to be good or enlightening in the traditional sense. Some of it might be really frustrating or really difficult or really scary, but it's exposing you to something that you ultimately need to see. So I think there's parallels to what's going on with, the UFO phenomena. Thinking about, Bertrand Mayhew and what he says about, it's elusive. It's, in the 1960s, there were these UFO breakdowns where, like, there was reported that there would be a craft, and then there would be, like, these entities scrambling around like they were trying to repair it, like it had broken down, and they needed to really quickly repair it. And he says there were a lot of witness reports of this, but every time they would fix it just before the cameras got there, just before, it could be undeniably true. And it seems, again, if you watch Skinwalker Ranch or you read the original Skinwalker Ranch book, again, it was like it was always one step ahead of them. They would be like, oh, we've got it for sure on camera this time. And then they go and they realize that their camera had been sabotaged. It stays, it's elusive. It stays under the radar. It will appear just long enough that enough people see it that there'll be intersubjective verification, but it won't stay long enough to appear, like we said, on camera or for the news to show up and say, here it is. Now, again, there have been some very, I think, convincing multi-witness sightings and things that have been caught on camera, but yet we still have all of these people who don't believe that this is a thing. And that's because it's never risen to that level of undeniability. This has to be true. It stays under that radar. So it's elusive. And even if I think individuals who interact with it realize that sometimes, and also realize that, again, sometimes they're given information that you hear it and you're like, that sounds bunk. Or there's sometimes they'll be like, oh, we just flew here from Venus, or we just flew here. You read some of the accounts from the 50s and 60s, that's what they would say. And that doesn't feel true now with what we know about these planets that are next to us. But again, I think the fact that they are not always telling the truth and that they're, again, being elusive, doesn't mean that it's malevolent, doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. I think it's part of how it presents, it's part of how it interacts with us, and it's there for a reason, and maybe leading us on a path of inquiry that leads us to a deeper truth.
Love that. You're making me think about, I'm not going to explain this very well, but I read this article on that element of shock and surprise when people experience something unusual, paranormally, anomalously, and how immediately, because of our conditioning, the reaction is often fearful, but that sometimes there's also a sense of humor involved. And the sense of humor aspect is so intriguing. Like, you know, it comes with really a sense of joy, playfulness, mischievousness. Yeah, I mean, that's another aspect of the trickster phenomenon I just find so intriguing. It's almost like they're teaching us to laugh at ourselves and loosen up a little bit and not take everything so seriously. I don't know. I mean, there's so many different explanations that people have of why that occurs. But I wanted to ask you also about your own experiences with the paranormal and the anomalous.
Sorry, Sinead, before you touch on that, can I do a follow-up on the trickster? If
Of
you don't mind?
course. Of course.
Just before I forget. So so Kim, I wanted to ask you, because earlier you had mentioned this multidimensional element in your research or your approach. Do you buy into this notion that potentially there could be, like, if we are multidimensional beings and there are like multidimensional or multi-layered elements to reality and experience, some of which maybe are more bound in our constructs of space-time than others, do you think that some of these tricksters may actually, like, on one level have malintent towards us and not have this like kind of ascendant transformational intention, but maybe because of the way that interaction plays out, like on this level of reality, maybe there's some like, there's notions of agreements with like higher selves and things like that, where we're kind of meant to go through this in order to have that transformation take place, and that the transformational intention behind it was on this other layer of reality, not like on this layer. Do you understand where I'm going with that?
No, I mean, so this is something that experiencers, not all, but some experiencers in their meaning making process, which I do explore in the book, will come to this conclusion, right? This idea that there's multiple things going on at once. And like at this layer of physical reality, it feels really violating, and either the entity or the person that they're interacting with may have ill intent in like this physical space, but that there's another layer to their sense of self, right? Where first of all, they understand the self as not coterminous with the body, as not, you know, not ending in death, as expanding into potentially other incarnations that are happening potentially simultaneously. And their sense of self as like an eternal soul that goes through this experience multiple times. And they feel that perhaps the effects of that interaction, there's the effects here in the embodied earthly 3D space time, but there may also be effects going on in terms of like the higher self, the soul, that, you know, are also unfolding, and that may have unfolded according to agreement or just may not be fully comprehensible to the three-dimensional self that exists here. And again, I'm not saying that this is the answer, but this is something that comes up time and again in experience or testimony as a way that people make sense of this, and that feels intuitively, once they come to that conclusion, it's just like it feels self-evident to them that this is what's going on, and they no longer feel violated anymore. And I don't think that comes from, some people say, oh, it's Stockholm syndrome, they just needed a reason to think that it wasn't bad. But the people that I've read and the people that I've interviewed who've come to that conclusion do not feel that way. And again, if it was Stockholm syndrome, sometimes this conclusion comes years after the original experience. You know, they're not even interacting with the entity anymore. So why would that be? Why would they need an explanation for it in that terms then? You know, Stockholm syndrome is when you're living like right there with the oppressor. And often also, Stockholm syndrome makes you weaker, and people walk away when they come to these realizations, they feel much more empowered. And much more aligned with it. And so to me, it just doesn't map. It doesn't seem true phenomenologically that this is, you know, mind control or Stockholm syndrome. It seems that this is emerging from some type of genuine experience that they had that felt very true to them. I'm not making the claim that it's literally true, but yeah.
I'm glad you said that, because that was one, there was a presentation at last year's Seoul Symposium in Italy by Dr. Bolander, where he presented that viewpoint that these experiences were not how John Mack kind of analyzed them and the free study, and that this is like a Stockholm syndrome type experience, whether it's like people who are kidnapped or sexually abused, and that's kind of what they're going through. And I did not agree with that at all. So I'm glad you brought that up.
I don't agree with it either, and I find it somewhat it's dismissive and condescending to these experiencers who have gone through that. Because if you actually take the time to speak to them and to learn from their experiences, it doesn't match up. You're saying, oh, you just think that because you're traumatized. That is a very, to me, dismissive perspective.
Yeah.
I find it just incorrect for a lot of reasons, but I'll leave it there.
We would both, Anthony just seconded that. I'm going to third it. I completely agree with you. It does not fit at all. And it is dismissive and it is disrespectful. So yeah, I mean, there's a great need for the people who are studying experiencers and talking about them to actually really get to know experiencers and their stories personally, not just reading about them in a book. I mean, there's so much that comes across when you, like you were saying early on in this conversation, right? The affect that people have when they tell these stories is a big part of the evidential experience of it, right? So Kimberly, you have so much experience in this field, coming from a researcher academic angle, but you also have had your own paranormal anomalous experiences. So please speak as much as you feel comfortable with as to your own experience, because I'm wondering not just, the story of what happened to you. I'm more interested in how has it affected your life, and in combination with the stories that you've gathered from other experiencers and the in-depth research that you've done in combination with your own experience, how has this changed your own personal philosophy, your worldview, how you walk through the world, how you approach your own life, how you experience reality? How has that changed?
So I want to go back to what, before we reverted back, you were talking about the humor in all of this. And I do want to go there because some of my experiences are really, they're hilarious. Like I look back at them and, there really was like an element of humor going on. And I'll give one as an example. But I want to emphasize that I came into this in 2020 completely as a researcher. And I was doing research about this for, 2 or 3 years, I think 3 years before any experiences started. And I had already formed a lot of, I had already learned a lot just from reading the experiences of others. Because sometimes people think, oh, you've had your own experience, you've lost all your objectivity. So many of the conclusions and almost everything that I say in the book, except in the final chapter where I talk about some of my experiences, all of those conclusions were formed prior to things beginning to occur in my life. And something that a lot of people don't talk about is that the line between researcher and experiencer doesn't really hold, because often when you start researching this, you start having your own experience. Say anything in terms of names, because these conversations take place in private, but I am not the only academic who started studying this from just a purely academic standpoint and then all of a sudden started having really bizarre things happen to them. Again, everybody's story is their own to tell, and I cannot ever say any names, but it's not just me, is all I'll say. Yep. So I was studying this for about 3 years before. I mean, I can look back now and there were certain like odd things that occurred. The first anomalous experience I ever had was with a Ouija board. And again, it goes back to this trickster thing and this, feeding through deceptive information, because it told us it was George Washington, and it like gave us these dates that it was born and died. And when I looked it up later, those were the actual years that George Washington was born and died. And I was really confused because at the time I was like, what the hell? Like the people who were doing it, like neither of us knew that those were actually the years that he was born and died. And I just couldn't make sense of it. And I think this was like 2017, 2018. So 2 years before the UFO thing. But I remember feeling just kind of, it was like something that always bothered me. I was like, what the hell was that? And then I even looked up, I was trying to Google it to figure out how it could have occurred. And it said like trickster spirits love to tell you that they're George Washington. Like that was one of the examples. And again, I was just like, what is going on? Like, this is weird. It like made me even more unsettled because I didn't have a worldview that accommodated that at all. And I was just like, I thought Ouija boards were like made up. You buy them at Target. They can't be like, there can't really be anything to them.
Yeah.
But
it's one of the default answers they scroll and pick.
So again, let's fast forward about 3 years into studying this. I started experiencing some poltergeist phenomena.
Wow.
Electronic equipment behaving very weirdly in my home. I had Alexa speakers and they would start going off at random times, always playing the same song. which was Billie Eilish's Goodbye. And I couldn't figure out, I even looked at the lyrics of that song and I was like, why is it this song? And I still don't really know, other than that it's just like a creepy song and it was like trying to be funny in that way. But it would sometimes go off at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and it would be like full blown speakers at 11, 3 a.m. Everything's going off. And I'm just like waking up, like, what the hell is going on? And then I would just be walking and my phone would play it randomly.
The same song?
The same song. And it got to the point, I was really freaked out by this, I'm not gonna lie. I was even like, I was consulting, I was like looking up like people who can come, and like I was convinced there was some kind of entity that was like attached to me and that was like in my house. And so I was like gonna pay somebody to come flush it out. I was just like up at all hours of the night. And so finally I was like, I'm gonna cut off all of its access. And so I was like, I disconnected every speaker in my house, and it used to play it on my phone in Spotify and YouTube, and I deleted Spotify, I deleted YouTube, I deleted any app that could play a song. I was just like, I'm just not going to give it access to me. Like, it's not going to be able to do this, right? And so a couple days after I had disconnected everything, I had like 2 days of peace. I was like, it can't find me. I won. I had to call an Uber, and I get into the Uber, and I'm sitting in the back.
No.
And the Uber driver's phone, he had Spotify on. It starts playing it through his phone.
Oh my God.
And he even looked at it. He was like, what? And he like looked at it and he like changed it. But for some reason in that moment, instead of being scared, I burst out laughing. I just was like, I just found it hilarious. I just started laughing. And I think I even said it out loud, like quietly, because I was in a car. But I was just like, all right, you got me. You win. And I just kind of said it like that. And then I just like went back to what I was doing. And it never happened again after that. Like that moment that I laughed instead of being scared, it stopped. And amazing. I've had others who have had certain experiences that is just like, when you get to that moment of laughter, it like suddenly like loses its grip on you. And like, it's just like, now all of a sudden it's, it's just like funny. And like, I think even Carl Jung said it was like, when you're laughing, it's like it's the psyche like realizing that something isn't as serious, or kind of like seeing through the illusion of something. It's something that you thought was really serious. You're just like suddenly like, this is just like actually fun, and now when I look back at it, I'm like, really, whatever it was, I don't know the mechanisms that were making that occur, but it wasn't this like scary, threatening thing that was there to harm me. It was just an interaction that was trying to, get me to release something, get me to release this, I think just this fear of interacting with, the other realms. And once I released that and laughed, it got, again, that particular, it never played that song again. It never bothered me that way.
Wow. And that truly speaks to the intersubjectivity, right? Like it elicited this laughter and that changed how it presented objectively, right?
Exactly, right. It was an interaction. It's like when my interaction towards it changed, right? And again, like I said, I was like sleeping with the lights on at one point. I was like, I was convinced that I had attracted some kind of like negative thing into my life, and but I was interacting to it from that fear space. And when I stopped interacting from that fear space and I just laughed, it changed the nature of how it was interacting with me. And I think that holds, a lot of experiencers have reported that they like came to a point where they changed the way that they were relating to it, and that changed the way that it showed up. Whether that was laughter or whether that was just like kind of acceptance or surrender, or just like, just moving past the fear. Like, I'm not going to be scared anymore. I'm just going to interact with this. And that the relation at that point becomes much more healthy, much more dialogical, much more co-creative.
I'm gonna tease one.
But yeah, that's the one experience. Like, there's been other things, but I'll leave it at that one.
That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome. And you don't know anyone who was really into Billy Idol, do you? Or anyone who loved that song?
Well, Billie Eilish. So my daughter really likes Billie Eilish, but she doesn't listen to that particular song because it's just like this short song at the end of one of her albums. And again, I think that really, I tried for a long time to say, what was the reason that it was that song, and I couldn't find anything other than, like I said, it was a creepy song. And so when it would play it, it would give like this really creepy vibe. And I think that was part of what it was trying to do. It'd be like, oh, this is scary type thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's all I could make out of it.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Halloween or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
Anthony,
go ahead,
go.
Sinead.
No.
I was just going to say we're running kind of low on time, and we should probably wrap it up shortly. So I had one more question, but if you have a follow up, Sinead, go for it.
No, I want you to ask your question. I think it's a great question. Yeah.
Okay. So Kim, I wanted to ask you about. So I got a chance to see you speak at the last Archives of the Impossible conference, and you and your colleagues there discussed this amazing metadata research project that they're doing over there down at Rice University at what is now called the Center for the Impossible, correct?
Correct.
Yes. So I want to just give you a few minutes to talk about that and kind of what that entails, what data you're looking into, and what the goals are, and where you're at now in the process.
Yeah, so for this project, I have to give all of my props to Karen Austin, who is the managing director of the project. It was her idea, and she's done a lot of labor over the past 3 years of just getting this off the ground. So mad recognition and props to Karen and all the work that she's done for this. The idea is that there are various collections of anomalous experiences sitting around, and some of them are now together at Rice. So we have the Whitley Strieber collection is there, letters that people wrote to Whitley. The John Mack collection is there, which is both his transcripts as well as letters people wrote to him. There is a 50-year embargo on the John Mack materials for the public, but we as researchers have some limited access to them. And then we're also looking to acquire other collections. They're in talks about some of Bud Hopkins' materials, some of David Jacobs' materials, some of Artie Six Killer Clark's materials. Again, these are tentative. Those are not there yet, but those are things that are on the horizon of possibility.
What about Jacques Vallée's?
And Jacques Vallée's materials are there. They're also currently on embargo, and I don't remember for how long, and they're not yet available to the public. I don't know when they'll be available.
But they're available to you all researching it already?
So we are not working with his materials yet. They may... I'm sure at some point, as we're developing the tools, that we'll also use his corpus. So the materials we're working with right now are the John Mack materials and the Whitley Strieber materials. That's what we're working with now. But we're developing the tools, and this is kind of the stage that we're at, to examine them phenomenologically. So to look at the contents and kind of pull out what the individual is describing as appearing, what are elements of their meaning making, so what appeared, how did they interpret it, what value were they giving to it, and then seeing if we can identify patterns across these different collections, right? And the more patterns, the more phenomenological categories that we uncover, then we can potentially test out different hypotheses, like I was saying earlier. What types of hypotheses about what this is or about what the universe is could explain some of this phenomenological data, and which ones don't hold up, right? And that includes, testing out the null hypotheses, people who say that this is all psychosis and sleep paralysis. Does that actually check out phenomenologically in terms of how people are describing this?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a long process. So some of it's been slower than we'd like, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of preparing the data. So some of this had to be anonymized. Some of them were handwritten and had to be typed into ways that we could actually read the handwriting and then analyze them. Because we're doing a combination of human coding, but we have so many artifacts that we're also going to be using artificial intelligence, LLMs, to assist in some of the, once we've identified the phenomenological codes and we've reached what's called saturation in qualitative research. It's just this idea that you've gone so far in the data set and nothing new has emerged. Once we have, the codes and we've kind of reached the phenomenological codes and we've reached saturation, then we'll use the AI to make it go faster because there's so many artifacts that we can't sit and look through all of them.
Can you give the audience an idea of the size of that data and the artifacts, just so they understand? I think it's the biggest project of its kind, right?
Right. So within the Strieber and Mack letters, there's about 7,500 artifacts. So obviously, Strieber had many more letters that were sent to him, but some of them were just thank you for the book. I really enjoyed it. So we're working with about the 3,000 letters that actually describe experiences that he donated. And then there's about 4,500 I might be switching the two. It's either one is 4,500, one's 3,000, but there's about 7,500 that we're working with on those two collections.
Amazing.
But then as we expand, all of these collections have several thousand, right? So if we acquire more collections or we go through the valet materials, that's like several thousand, more documents. So we're trying to build the initial framework that once we have it set up, we can move through future collections with more speed. So that's a long process. And some of it isn't really fun work. Some of it's, again, like I said, it's doing transcription, it's correcting transcriptions, and then also starting the phenomenological coding, reading a letter carefully, pulling out the different elements of what's described, deciding what the different categories are going to be. And then right now our team is working with different AI tools, because we can't just put this into like chat or some kind of, it has to be an internal LLM that would protect privacy, because some of these, like Max materials it has to be HIPAA compliant. Like these are people's medical information is in there, so you can't put it into just any LLM. So Great. We're working with developing an internal LLM that would not have public access that we could use to help pull out some of this. So that's kind of the stage that we're at right now. We are making good progress in terms of we've identified an LLM. And we're working on developing the initial codes and reaching saturation so we can get a good framework that we can then apply to different data sets. But the idea is to, as much as possible, be phenomenological. Like really just look, what were people describing, and try to leave our own frameworks of possibility and impossibility at the door, and also see these different collections reported to different people from different parts of the world. What's similar in them, or maybe what's different in them, right? Did people report different things to David Jacobs than they did to John Mack, than they did to RE6 Killer Clark? Are there divergences in their meaning-making processes? How does all of that play into the interpretation of the experience? Wow. But it's also there, you were talking about threat narratives earlier. It's an attempt to say, hey, does the threat narrative really line up to what people were describing in their lived experience? Another thing that I'll say is at some point we may want to expand this, because a lot of the contemporary experiencer community is in Reddit. And so there's also talk at some point, there's like hundreds of thousands of experiences described in like the Reddit forum that we may also start analyzing those as well, to get an idea of like the contemporary experiences that people are having, because that's a major site of meaning making. But again, asking, this dominant narrative that's being, given to the public, this idea of UFOs as like this alien invasion, extraterrestrial threat. Asking, does that seem plausible based on what the people are describing, across these various data sets? And maybe the answer will be yes, that it is. But for those of us who have spent a lot of time looking at this, that's not the phenomenological patterns that emerge, right? And we just want to have as many different examples of that as possible, so we can say, no, look, this is a consistent pattern that shows up across this percentage of the letters are experiencing some type of separation of consciousness from the body, or something like that, and to be able to meaningfully kind of work through these different data sets in a way that does take that restorative or that idea of letting it appear, listening, right? Even if it's not somebody speaking verbally, people speak through these artifacts, letting these artifacts speak. What are they saying? Can we witness it fully? Can we hear it fully? Can we not reduce it? Can we not flatten it? And can we allow ourselves to build on the possibilities that it engenders for our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of the UFO, and our understanding of the universe as a whole?
Amazing.
Yes, and
Can we just to the whole world?
We can just close it right now. That was perfect. That was amazing, Kimberly. Thank you so much. I mean, honestly, this has just been the most wonderful conversation, because the work you're doing is amazing, but also how you communicate the work that you're doing is so understandable. Like, you really make it very understandable and relatable, because a lot of people in our community don't have the vocabulary that academics have to explain these things.
Right.
You're making it really understandable, and it's beautifully articulated. So thank you so much. Honestly, this has been such a pleasure. Yeah. Thank you for being here.
This has been a pleasure for me too. So thank you both. You both asked very insightful questions. So It's been very enjoyable for me.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Because asking good questions is extremely important to us. We don't want to do it the same way. Like, we really want to make these conversations really rich and meaningful and a little different, a little unique,
Yeah.
allow people to really speak from the heart as well as from the intellect. And I feel like you did that. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Anthony, any last comments, or should we just say goodbye? I feel like we can.
Sign us off. Let's do it.
All right, wonderful. So Kimberly, thank you again. And Anthony, thank you for being just the best co-host ever. Could not ask for better.
Stop. Likewise.
Really,
Thank
like,
you.
yeah, it's a pleasure to be doing this. And it's such an important part of, I think, what humanity is now, right, in the modern day, to investigate these kinds of things, because it is a reality. It's been a reality for thousands and thousands of years, as we know from our Indigenous people. So it's a really wonderful time to be alive in many ways, right, that we have the access to explore these things. And we're grateful to our audience for being here to explore them with us. It's a journey that we're all on together. We need to be able to have these conversations and ask the questions and have the discussions and maybe be a little uncomfortable sometimes, right? So thank you so much, everyone. Please come back for more. Like, subscribe, share, all the things. You know what to do. Leave us your comments, your questions. We want to hear from you, and we really want to meet you as well. So if you ever see us in person, come up and say hi. And look for Kimberly. I just called you Kiffany. Look for Kimberly's. I don't know where they came from. Look for Kimberly's book. Obviously, it's going to be astounding. You've heard her reference a few things in this interview that make it sound just incredibly juicy. So I can't wait to dig in. She's worked hard on it for 3 years. And Kimberly, do you have a Substack?
I do, but I only have like one article there so far. So I'm not super active on Substack, but I do have one, so I'm happy to give it to you to post. Nobody hold me to producing there regularly.
Okay. Well, we'll include that in the description. We'll also include a link to Kimberly's academia.edu page and anything else she wants to share with you all.
There'll be a link to my book.
Perfect.
Great, we'll definitely do that. Definitely. There's really, 2026 is looking to be an exciting year. And I think your work is a big part of that. So so thank you everyone for being here, and we'll see you next time. Keep doing what you do. Bye for now.
Thank you guys. And thank you, Kim, so much for doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.